Following their comments, several scholars give their thoughts on defense spending. The event was hosted by the Council for a Livable World.
Good morning. We are, as usual, in the midst of conflicting demands on people's time. We set this for a 3-hour period with the full understanding, given the pressures that affect members and others, that we will have a kind of a rotating audience. But I did want to begin now. We will be hearing from some members of Congress, and then we will have a panel. And the panel will reflect what is our two-part message. First, we believe, judging it purely on the merits, the request that the President has made is unjustified. That is, overwhelmingly, among those of us in Congress who are critical, and I believe among many of the organizations who will be joining with us, there is a commitment to the notion of America being by far the strongest nation in the world. Many of us do believe, in the current world context, there is no better alternative than for the United States to maintain overwhelming force compared to potential adversaries. And many of us are supportive of the evolving multilateral peacekeeping role, which is, of course, expensive. What we firmly believe, however, is that the current budget is already far larger than is needed for that. And so we are particularly opposed to these increases because we think that the legitimate mission of protecting every valid national security interest, both from the standpoint of defense and from the standpoint of peacekeeping, can be met easily with a budget that is in fact less rather than more than the current budget. One of the arguments we get is that there has been a substantial decline in military spending. That is true. There has, however, been an even more substantial decline in the threats that the military spending is dealing with. Indeed, if what had happened to the Soviet Union had happened, for instance, to cancer, and that would be a wonderful thing, if we had seen a collapse in the incidence of cancer comparable to the collapse in the Soviet Union and its allies, the budget for the National Cancer Institute would have gone down by a much greater percentage than the military budget. If everyone in America were to be substantially housed, we would expect the HUD budget to go down. The Pentagon budget is an exception in that the real purpose for it has substantially changed, and the budget has not adequately reflected that. People talk about the new threats. The problem we face here is, in the first place, that these are not new threats. North Korea, Iraq, Iran, these are not creations of the last few years. All of those nations, with their unfortunate tendencies, with their aggressive and threatening aspects towards their neighbors, were in existence 10 years ago and more. What's changed is the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's been a qualitative change in the nature of the mission of the American defense establishment, and that has not yet been reflected in our budget. From the late 30s with the rise of Hitler until the early 90s with the final collapse of the Soviet Empire, and that collapse has been total. We, when I first got here in 1981, were confronted with the Warsaw Pact, and the Pentagon said we had to take into account a potential threat, not just from the entire Soviet Union, but from their allies, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, etc. Many of us raised the question that these were unreliable, and they said, well, we can't take that into account. We have to look at what they've got. What they have got no longer exists. We have seen an extraordinary diminution in the threat, with all those Eastern European countries defecting, with the Soviet Union itself being demolished. The nuclear capacity of Russia today is a threat to us, not because they might intentionally go to war with us, but because they can't keep track of it. We, for instance, are now maintaining a higher level of nuclear weapons than even the Pentagon thinks necessary, at the cost of billions of dollars, because Congress said we must stay up to the level that was called for by the First START Treaty. And we cannot get down to the level that we would get in the later START treaties. We have this mismatch. we are being told by my congressional colleagues that we cannot reduce our number of nuclear weapons to the amount called for in the treaties. The Russians, on the other hand, can't afford to get up to the level that they would be allowed in the treaties. The problem with Russia is that they simply cannot afford to have as many weapons as they are told they can't have any more than. Indeed, the situation is so odd that you can't describe it grammatically. The threat, as I said, has very substantially diminished. We are not talking about anything that threatens the enormous imbalance between the United States and the rest of the world. What we haven't had is a strategic re-examination. We are still being told that we have to fund a defense budget that allows us to win an all-out nuclear war with a non-existent Soviet Union and simultaneously have the forces in being to win two full-scale contemporaneous conventional wars in which America almost alone is fighting other countries. It is true that North Korea is a threat. It is also true that South Korea is larger and better armed and better equipped than North Korea. So our role as an ally of South Korea in a potential conflict with North Korea constrains what we have to do. We are told that Iraq is a serious problem. Years ago, less than 10, the United States went to war with Iraq. The war lasted a few days. No one that I know of argues that Iraq is today a stronger military power than it was back in 1991 before all of what has transpired. So then the final point I would make about excess is this. John McCain, certainly no advocate of lower defense spending. I guess he thinks we should spend more, but he acknowledges, in fact, he took the lead in showing that Congress has every year added billions of unnecessary dollars to the Pentagon. $4 billion was John McCain's last count. That's without base closing. That's with politically inspired decisions by the Congress to foist on the Pentagon weapons it does not need. In fact, if you look at the world today and you look at what is the source of weapons being aimed at the Pentagon that the Pentagon would like to repel, they don't come primarily from Iraq or Iran or North Korea. They come from the United States Congress. The United States Congress is the main source of adding weapons that the Pentagon does not want. Most of us, I'm not aware of any exceptions who serve in Congress, are in favor of improving the living condition of our troops. We're a very wealthy nation. It is not appropriate for us to count on straightened economic circumstances so that only lower economic echelons come and defend us and do it cheaply. I am prepared to support this. We firmly believe that a re-examination of the strategic mission after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a reasonable insistence that our wealthy European allies pick up a fair share of the defense, particularly of Western Europe, and an end to the congressional pork process would allow us to maintain easily the sort of defense capacity Americans are entitled to and that we think would be beneficial in the world, not only without this increase, but with even less. But then there's a second point. In 1997, over the objection of many of us, Congress adopted the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. The budget was, of course, coming into balance without that act, and it was, I think, socially unfair. But it has one very real impact today. That budget imposes an overall limit on spending, on discretionary spending. Under that budget regime, which we operate under today, and which the Republican majority says they want to stick to, they say, we cannot undo that. They do not want any of the additional revenues that are coming now into the federal government because of tax increases and a strong economy. They don't want any of those being used for spending. That means every dollar we spend additionally on the Pentagon comes out of domestic spending. I represent the town of Fairhaven, Massachusetts. I am now engaged with them in a struggle with the Environmental Protection Administration because EPA has told them that a hazardous waste site in that town, near a school, near Buzzards Bay, threatening water resources, they have been told that they cannot have the hazardous material removed. It must be kept on site in a way that makes everybody nervous. Why? Because the EPA doesn't have enough money to get rid of it. Well, the people in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, and the people that I and my colleague, Mr. McGovern, represent in that part of Massachusetts are far more threatened by hazardous waste leaking into the water supply than they are by an invasion of Western Europe. And a budget which funds billions of dollars so that America protects Western Europe against a non-existent invasion at the cost of an adequate cleanup of that hazardous waste site endangers the security of Americans. We passed legislation of which the President is very proud to help communities hire 100,000 new police officers. Under that legislation, we, the federal government, pay for the first 3 years of those police officers. Unless we adopt some changes, the next 20 years or so of those police officers' careers are picked up by local taxes. And many of the communities will not be able to maintain that extra level of police. Once again, we have low-income people all over this country who live in areas where crime is a problem. And I believe they are better protected by keeping those 100,000 police out there fully funded and hiring the new 50,000 the President talked about than they are, once again, by keeping more nuclear weapons than the Pentagon thinks we need. We have continued problems with health care. The President says, and I'm delighted that he wants to extend prescription drugs to Medicare. All those things are competing with the Pentagon for dollars. And while the President has proposed some increases in closing tax loopholes, which many of us support, the likelihood that they will pass is not high in every case. So it is very, very simple. Given the Balanced Budget Act, not only is the increased spending the President asked for unnecessary, if it comes at the expense of the Women's, Infant, and Children Feeding Program, of environmental protection, of police on the streets, of adequate housing for people with special needs and elderly people and others. That is why many of us believe the single most important thing we can do right now is to show why this money is unnecessary and what the costs are of spending it. What we will now do is, several of my colleagues have joined us. We will hear from some of my colleagues, and then at 11 o'clock we have a panel which consists both of experts in military spending who can, I think, show very clearly why the increased spending is unnecessary, even given the strictest notion of what America's true national security requires. And we will also have people who are engaged in trying to meet some of the pressing domestic needs of this country in health and environment, in poverty alleviation, in getting welfare workers to work. All things America says it's for, but which it will not adequately do if we continue to waste money at the Pentagon. And now, in the order in which my colleagues have joined us, let me call on some of those who have been waging this fight and will continue to do it. First, my colleague from Vermont, Bernie Sanders.
Thank you, Barney, and I want to congratulate you for your continued leadership in this area. I get around the state of Vermont a whole lot, and I talk to many people all over the country. And what people are saying to me is that in this country, the richest country in the history of the world, there is something very wrong that 43 million Americans have no health insurance at all, and millions more are underinsured. And as Barney Frank just indicated, it makes no sense at all to be talking about putting another $110 billion into the military, as the President would like, or even worse, 140 plus into the defense, as the Republicans want, when millions of people have no health insurance, millions of more have inadequate health insurance, and tens of millions are unable to afford the prescription drugs that they desperately need. It makes no sense to me to be spending $100 billion a year defending Europe and Asia against non-existent enemies when in this country we have by far the highest rate of childhood poverty in the industrialized world. When we have over 20% of our kids living in poverty, when senior citizens all over this country cannot afford basic needs like keeping their homes warm or paying for their out-of-pocket health care that they need. The two basic issues are, number one, given the end of the Cold War, given the collapse of the Soviet Union, does any sensible person really believe that we need to spend billions and billions more on the military? Does any sensible person believe that our military posture should be to simultaneously be fighting two wars without any allies to protect us, despite all of the money that NATO spends? And I think the obvious answer is no. There is enormous waste in the military right now. We all know that. We all know that pork is rampant, where various districts get money for the military that is not needed. So the truth of the matter is we can have the strongest defense in the world. We can raise the pay and the benefits that our military does need, but you don't have to spend more money on the defense or the CIA or the intelligence budget to do that. But the most important point that I want to make is that we have got to get our priorities straight. We cannot continue to cut back on Medicare. We cannot continue to have Medicaid paying, in my state, about 1/3 of the normal reimbursements that physicians and hospitals get. We cannot continue to have millions of people spending 50, 60% of their limited incomes on housing at the same time as we cut back on affordable housing. In this great country, what we have got to do is make sure that all of our people have a decent standard of living, not continuing to cut on the needs of working families, senior citizens, veterans, low-income people, and then say to the military, hey, we can give you everything you need and then some more. So I think for those of us who believe in insane priorities in this country, for those of us who believe that every American is entitled to a decent standard of living, we have got to stand up and oppose this outrageous proposal to increase military spending. Thank you very much.
Next, we'll hear from my colleague from Massachusetts, Representative Jim McGovern.
Well, first of all, I want to commend my colleague Barney Frank and the others here for initiating this conference today and for initiating a discussion in Washington on the military budget, something that is absolutely necessary that we engage in. It's a discussion that should not only happen here in Washington, but it should happen on every college campus in this country, in every chamber of commerce, in every union hall, before every community group, because what we are talking about here is our nation's priorities. Barney is absolutely right, and Bernie is absolutely right when they say that this $110 billion increase in military spending over the next 6 years is unjustifiable. There is no military reason, no military justification for this added expenditure. It does not add to our national security. It does not, redundancy does not add to our national security, and we all know that in the military budget there does exist a great deal of redundancy. Weapon systems that the Pentagon doesn't even want, or weapon systems that have long outlived their usefulness. We need to have a discussion about what our priorities are within our military budget. We need to insist on a tough military, the strongest military, second to none, but that is not that does not occur by adding additional billions of dollars to systems that we don't need. I really do think we've come to a point where we need to redefine what we mean by the national security interests of the United States of America. I mean, it means more, it should mean more than just the number of weapons that we have in our nuclear arsenal. I was with the President of the United States yesterday in Massachusetts. We visited a school that we visited because it had all the best equipment. It was hooked up to the information superhighway. It had great classrooms, great teachers, great equipment. It was an example of what every other school in this country should be like. Yet every other school in this country is not like that. I have schools in my congressional district that were built when Ulysses Grant was President of the United States. And while that may be a tribute to Ulysses Grant and his architect and his builder, the reality is that our kids deserve much better. And it is estimated that to bring our schools up to the level where they are equipped to teach our children the needs and the challenges for the 21st century, it's about a $300 billion investment. We are not going to meet the challenges of education if we invest the way we are right now in wasteful military expenditures. Bernie Sanders mentioned health care. You know, we are all struggling in our districts with these terrible cuts that were invoked in the Balanced Budget Act that have devastated home health care, that have devastated our teaching hospitals. I mean, if we care about health care, and I think that should be added to the definition of national security, then we need to redirect our priorities. Barney Frank mentioned the issue of hazardous waste. I mean, the environmental problems, the environmental catastrophes all over this country that we don't even have the money to begin to deal with. I mean, that's a threat to our national security. Crime, substance abuse and addiction, all those kinds of things that we need to deal with. We are not dealing with because we say we don't have the money, but yet we have the money to invest in the military budget without doing an adequate analysis in terms of eliminating wasteful expenditures. So I want to say that I'm happy to be here. I want to thank my colleagues for being here and thank them for getting this discussion going. And I hope that we will, in fact, before this Congress is out, end up having a significant impact on what actually is approved by this Congress. Thanks.
Next, one of those who's been fighting for a long time against the military excesses and for a better sense of priorities, Congressman Pete DeFazio of Oregon.
Thanks, Barney, and thanks for your continued leadership on this issue. You know, the President, with his budgetary submission, in my mind, has opened a Pandora's box. He has given credibility to the flat earth, cold warriors in the right of the Republican Party who think that, you know, we need to dump infinitely more and more resources on a Pentagon that is already misspending billions of dollars. The Pentagon has a computer that's still ordering parts for weapons that they've retired. The Pentagon has a computer that's ordering parts in excess of a 100 years war supply, and they simply don't care because they don't have to care because they have so much money. At the same time, they cry about retention problems and problems with the troops, and we still have 16,000 families on food stamps in the military. That is a travesty and a shame. But we don't need to throw $112 billion more at the Pentagon to resolve that problem. We could cancel some of the unneeded, you know, new C-130s from Newt Gingrich's district, which you know, are planes that you know, are beyond the needs of the military. They'll have to retire planes that have 10 years life left in order to build the planes that were funded in last fall's supplemental under the guise of readiness and retention. You know, we are locked once again in an arms race, a superpower arms race. The world's one superpower is madly wrestling and competing with itself in some bizarre shadow boxing sort of duel. There is no credible you know, threat from another superpower to the United States. Yes, we need to maintain a minimal military to stave off threats to our country, but not with weapons designed for Cold War superpower adversaries like the Soviet Union, the B-2 bomber, a weapon that was designed to fight World War IV, to find and destroy targets in the Soviet Union after World War III had occurred. Anything that might be left would be destroyed by the B-2 bomber. You know, that was an absurd mission at the time, and it's doubly absurd now that the Pentagon, I mean, you know, now that the Soviet Union doesn't exist, and yet we are forcing more B-2 bombers on the Pentagon that itself even doesn't find that they're necessary. So I congratulate the people who are here today and gathered to discuss a sane policy that will meet the real threats the United States will come in the next century, which are economic, educational, health care, crime in the streets, drug addiction and lack of treatment for people who have substance abuse problems. Those are real threats to our security in the next century, and those are things we could be addressing if we weren't wasting the money elsewhere.
Next, another one who has been fighting very hard as a member of Congress for a more adequate response to the very pressing needs we have at home and against the military excesses that steal from those resources, Congressman Major Owens from New York.
I, too, want to thank you, Barney, for continuing this dialogue, for creating a dialogue. It appears that around here there are all kinds of efforts made to suppress dialogue and limit public debate and public discussion, especially on matters that are most important. And I can think of nothing more important than a proposal to expend $110 billion on a defense budget at this time in the nation's history. At a time when we're saying that we want to use all available surpluses to take care of Social Security and a few other emergencies. At a time when we're saying we don't have the money to provide adequate education programs. We take a Mickey Mouse approach to education programs, and we announce new programs like the after-school program with great fanfare and large numbers of sound bites, and it's a very tiny program. We're increasing it from $200 million to $600 million, and maybe we'll serve 1 million youngsters out of all the millions of youngsters out there who need after-school programs. We talk about accountability in the schools and the end of social promotion, a lot of other things that don't really cost very much money, and we're not appropriating money. We talk about helping construction, school construction, and all we have to propose is to pay the interest on the bonds that local and state governments borrow, not to make a direct appropriation. Why not $110 billion for schools, school construction? Why not strike where the federal government can do the most good, and that's the physical infrastructure of schools? Why not define national security, as my colleague has defined it, in much bigger terms? The most important component of national security is an educated population. I'm sure many of you read, as I read, that the latest Navy aircraft carrier, what's the problem with the latest Navy aircraft carrier? Any of you know what they cited? They don't have personnel to staff it. The Navy is short of personnel in general. Why are they short of personnel? It's not because they can't find plenty of people out there who would be happy to join the Navy and the other armed services. The problem is the qualifications and standards are much higher. They want people who can operate computers. They want a high-tech, trained set of soldiers who, in high-tech capacity, that they don't have. Wouldn't it make more sense to civilianize our defense effort, our national security effort, at the same time you're creating a pool of people who can go into the armed services who are cyber technicians and can deal with the cyber civilization that we're going toward? And of course the military always leads. Military created the internet, military created radar, military created mass communication. You know, American people financed all that, and billion-dollar companies are taking advantage of it now, but it was all financed by the American people. They've always been on the cutting edge. Why not recognize that cutting edge and provide a massive training program in our public schools which will benefit both the military and the civilian economy? If you want to set up some new form of ROTC, maybe that'll be a way to lure military dollars into the classroom and get a bigger benefit from them. I'm not against national security and spending money on national security. None of us are. We just don't want to see more of the boondoggle, more of the waste. Democrats cringe in our caucuses whenever you talk about spending a lot of money. They don't want to be labeled as big spenders. There's a lot of hypocrisy around that because they are ready to endorse $110 billion over a 6-year period for defense, and yet they don't want to be labeled as big spenders. American people are far ahead of our Democratic caucus and politicians in general in Washington. You know, we had a highway bill. I call it a highway bill. It's a transportation bill. You know, the small portion that was for mass transit. Most of it was for highways. $218 billion over a 6-year period. Very few Democrats or Republicans were criticized in the last election for being big spenders because they voted for that bill. And 99% of us voted for it. We voted for a big spending bill for highways, and the American people, being way ahead of us, decided we need it. You know, if we need it, then let's pay for it. If we need to improve the infrastructure for schools across the country, and the General Accounting Office says we need about $110 billion, why don't we put the $110 billion into building schools, modernizing schools, upgrading the technology, education technology in schools, and have that be a benefit to our military. Also, I'm all for increasing the salaries of military, for having better career programs and retaining people. There are a number of things that we can do which will cost far less than $110 billion. There's another danger of this open-ended funding for the military. That is that our foreign policy, our peacekeeping policies around the world are going to be skewed by the fact that the military is the one place that can spend money. I think we should get the military out of Bosnia. I was all in favor of going into Bosnia, Yugoslavia, that whole area. Now, Kosovo, you know, I'm all in favor of the United States having a presence there, taking the leadership, as I was in favor of the United States liberating Haiti by going in. But whereas in Haiti we said we're not going to spend money on nation building, We wouldn't even help build courts and jails. We are now embarked on nation building in Bosnia with an open end. We've already spent $8 billion, and they are ready to let us stay there for a long time. They'll create more trouble of a nature that requires the military in order to hold our military forces there, because an occupying army spends money. It helps the economy. It's the wrong approach. It's the worst way to spend American taxpayers' money for peace. You know, civilian people, diplomatic corps, other kinds of foreign aid would be far more useful and effective and less expensive. So this open-ended funding, where we're headed with the military, where they also admit that they can't account for a lot of money. We know the story of the CIA losing $2 billion by rumor. They said they lost $2 billion and couldn't find it. Later on, it turned out they lost $4 billion and couldn't find it in their accounting scheme. And now, you know, the Pentagon has the same problem. Nothing is more wasteful than to pour money into defense at this point. And I hope that we will raise the level of the visibility of the dialogue so the American people will look and see this is the worst way to spend our dollars. Thank you.
Thank you, Major. In the interest of intellectual honesty, and Major mentioned aircraft carriers, I did want to note that we are concerned, we are told, about other enemies. And I did note that China, the People's Republic of China, who people talk about, did acquire an aircraft carrier for the first time. So that maybe there is this threat. The People's Republic of China has bought an aircraft carrier, and it is serving as an amusement park in China. They have anchored it off their coast. And so this is the first aircraft carrier in the history of China, and it is an amusement park. Less amusing, of course, is the $100 billion we're going to waste unnecessarily. And we've now been joined by one of those who best understands. Major Owens talked about how to deal with the international threats. And the paradox is that we are, I think, providing too few resources to deal with the terrible problems of poverty and disease in various parts of the world. The debt burden is crushing for many countries we want to help. We could do something with debt relief. And one of those who has worked hardest in this, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, chairs or is the senior Democrat on the Appropriations Subcommittee that deals with international operations. And she's had a very real sense of the problems we face with the mismatch in our resources. So I'm delighted to call on our colleague Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you, Barney. Thanks for your leadership in bringing us together this morning. What we do in this Congress is spend a great deal of time on the budget, whether it is in the authorizing committees establishing priorities, discussing policy, or in the Budget Committee establishing the blueprint, or in the Appropriations Committee where, as Barney mentioned, I serve making the final decisions, spending decisions. And that budget, I believe, should be a statement of our national values. And in it, we should regard the strength of our country as the health, the education, and well-being of our people, as well as our military might. So it is in that spirit that I, again, thank you and applaud you, Barney, for bringing us together here this morning, because this is not about being anti-military. I believe that we have to have a proper defense for our country, and I certainly believe that we must support the quality of life and the readiness issues for American troops. But that isn't what this money, this additional $110 billion is necessary for. It's about new and additional military systems. If the money that we had now were applied appropriately to readiness and to quality of life issues for our troops, we wouldn't really need the additional funds. But again, about that statement of our national values. Is it a statement of your values to spend $110 billion over the next 5 or 6 years for the military, while we are committing $6 billion over that same time frame for helping people who are caring for a person with disabilities in the home? Is it a statement of your national values to spend that $110 billion on the military, while so many children in America, maybe 10 million, do not have access to quality health care? It is a statement of your values to do that while we do not provide adequate accommodations for children for the schools in which they are to learn, and we tell them it's very important for them to learn. The list goes on and on about the number of people without health care in America rising to 43 million now, even more than when this debate started, when the Clinton administration came in. I salute the President's efforts for quality health care. We did not succeed, but that doesn't mean that we should be spending $110 billion on the military. We send such a mixed message to our young people in this country when we tell them, again, that education is important, and yet we don't commit the resources necessary for the kind of education that they should have, and again, committing the resources to the school buildings, wiring them for the future, ridding them of lead and asbestos, not having overcrowded classrooms or having kids learn in the faculty lounge or in the hallway because there's not adequate space for them. We send them a mixed message when we say, don't smoke, smoking is bad for your health, and yet we don't value health by giving them access to quality health care. Kids are smart. They get the message. This must not be important. What are we talking about my health for when I don't have access to quality health care? And when we tell them that the work ethic is very important in their lives, and yet we don't pay a living wage to people who work full-time in our country. So somehow or other, this statement of our values about how we commit our resources to the strength of our country, that is, the health, education, and well-being of America's families, is a message that kids get in a mixed way as well. Barney mentioned some other ways that we can keep the peace. I always take my guidance from Pope Paul VI, who said, if you want peace, work for justice. And there's a great deal more work we could be doing throughout the world to promote democratic freedoms. Everybody who ever lived in our era, Barney and I were born a day apart, and he likes to add, I was born first, so that everybody knows I'm older than Barney. Gosh. And now I told them I blabbed. Anyway, they might have known otherwise, I'm afraid. In any event, the President Kennedy, everybody knows what his speech was. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do. He's prefaced it by saying, I say to the citizens of the people of America. His next sentence is one that I have in my office all the time as a constant reminder. He says, to the citizens of the world, ask not what America can do for you, but what we can do working together for the freedom of mankind. And that is what we're supposed to be doing. Preventive diplomacy is supposed to be preventive. We should be working for justice in these countries. All the issues that we've talked about, workers' rights, environmental protection, human rights, establishment of democratic institutions. There's so much we can be doing. There's so many, Kosovo, we're going into Kosovo. We don't have too many good options there, but that was such a predictable problem. I'm not saying that the Clinton administration didn't inherit a bad situation there, but nonetheless, what could we have done working with the people of the world, with the Europeans and the rest, early enough so that we're not considering a military option at this time? So I guess it comes down to, what is the birthright of every American child? Here we are in a booming economy, the stock market skyrocketing. So many months, what is it, 72, 90-something months of consecutive growth. Third year where we have a surplus in our budget. And still 1 in 5 children, and in California, 1 in 4 children living in poverty in our country. Something's wrong with this budget, something's wrong with this picture if we're not addressing the birthright of America's children. Most of these children live in families where parents work, but they don't make a living wage. So what should we be doing from a budgetary standpoint? I think much more to give value to the birthright of every American child. And that's why I oppose the President's proposal for $110 billion more. We certainly have other places that we need to spend it that will strengthen our country more than additional military systems. And I will work with Barney under his leadership and with the Progressive Caucus and our other colleagues that who have spoken here today to fight in the subcommittee, in the full committee, on the floor, in the Congress, and in the country to hopefully have our budget be a true statement of values of the American people and certainly of the people in this room. Thank you once again, Barney.
Thank you, Nancy. And I have a couple more colleagues who are going to join us. But let me just say first, in some ways, I regret the fact that we have to put this on here. This is the sort of debate that should be taking place on the floor of the House and on the floor of the Senate and isn't. I have checked the rules, and there is nothing that says we can't talk about relevant things. It's not mandatory, but it is permissible. And it would seem to me that this sort of debate ought to be happening. We have not, since the end of the Cold War, had a serious debate in either House of Congress on what the response of America ought to be to this drastically changed situation. We have not looked at the kind of economic threats that many Americans now face, which have become, if you look at the average American, or even the superior or below average American, because they count too, if you look at what's affected their lives recently, military security issues have been fairly low on the list. Economic issues have been a problem. Problems in Asia, problems in Brazil, problems with steel being sent here in excessive amounts. Those are the things that have a real impact. And what we are doing is diverting both attention and resources into solving the problems of 10 and 15 years ago. So one of the things we are going to do as a group, and I'm delighted to note, I hope people are keeping count, but we will have had 10 or a dozen members of the House today here on a day when there are a lot of conflicting things, committee organizing. That's a fairly significant outpouring. Part of the problem is the structure of the Congress. The Armed Services Committee consists of a lot of very intelligent people, but they are self-selected on the whole to be overwhelmingly people who are supportive of the military, who represent areas where the military is an important part of the local economy. What we need to do is to prevail on the leaderships, Democratic and Republican, in both branches, to structure debates in the House and in the Senate so some of these fundamental questions get debated. Because it is the case, if you accept every strategic assumption that has been made, if you look at the world as essentially unchanged, then the case for increased spending gets stronger. Our argument is not that you don't need to spend if you plan to do everything they say they have to be able to do, although we think you can save a lot even there, but we also think there are fundamental issues about what it is we are saying that we have to do. There is a great exaggeration of the threat, and if you exaggerate the threat and overinflate the mission, then you have argued for more money. And again, we also want people to understand, look at what Bill Clinton said, and many of us felt that the initiatives he proposed were only a beginning in many areas, not nearly enough. But even the initiatives Bill Clinton proposed in the State of the Union will go nowhere if you have these military spending increases, because the alternative revenue sources the President proposed are unlikely to pass. Many of us will vote for them. But if the military is allowed to increase, and I heard the other day Secretary Cohn's testimony in which he noted to the Armed Services Committee that the budget firewalls are down. And he was essentially inviting the Armed Services Committee people to go into the domestic area and take some spending, so that what we are doing in the area of the environment or children's health or public safety or any of these other areas, that could be even further diminished. And now I'm going to call on the final two of my colleagues, and then at 11 o'clock our panelists have arrived. We'll go into the panel. The next speaker is someone who has been fighting as long and as hard and as creatively for a more rational allocation of American resources as anybody in Washington, the senior Democrat on the Judiciary Committee. And I stress that because we've had the senior Democrat on the Foreign Operations Appropriation Subcommittee. We've had senior members as well as junior members elsewhere. This is a group that has pretty wide representation in the Democratic caucus. And what we are hoping is that we will begin with this effort today, the kind of national debate that we need to have about our changed national security requirements. And now I'm delighted to call on John Conyers.
Thanks so much, Mr. Frank. Ladies and gentlemen, I have my same notes about the military budget increase and the abuse to the projected budget surplus that will occur. But today I am struck by a hope to elicit from Mr. Borsaj and Mr. Greider in particular something about the psychology of this subject matter that makes it so awful easy to support irrational, nonsensical military buildups with literally no rational justification whatsoever, and makes it so awful hard for us to have to come together ourselves to figure ways to persuade even our friends to recognize that we're not going to move forward in the way that we're advertising unless we make some very serious adjustments that are more easily made in this part of the budget, the military budget, than anywhere else. So what I'm trying to look at is how we change the psychology of this debate, particularly with reference to citizens. Our unions and labor people in a affected military construction area will tell you, well, there are jobs. And sure, there are jobs. And one of the things that I don't think has ever been seriously addressed on a sustained basis is the whole question of how we deal with job conversion as we reduce the military to an intelligent size. And then to inquire into how we begin to move people away from this automatic knee-jerk responsibility. I think we have a lot of people in our citizenry that really support our position that in the course of the way it's built, their voices can't rise to the top. So that's the new perspective with which I am joining you today. My list of abusive projects is the same as they were 2 weeks ago when we last met. And the only thing I'm afraid of is that somebody will say, well, no, they got worse because while you weren't looking, somebody tacked on something else. I hope I don't hear that. But thank you very much for this intervention. And if you're not at one of the many meetings you do, I'll let everyone know what committees you want to be on.
Thank you. My senior on the Judiciary Committee and I at 11 o'clock have to go pick which Judiciary Subcommittee we want to be on. It's kind of like being in a shooting gallery and there are about 500 targets. You only got 3 shots, so it's kind of hard to pick which one. But there is the subcommittee which will be charged with reenacting or not the independent counsel statute. Will attract a certain amount of interest while we're on the subject of gross wastes of money and abuse. And our final member who has joined us today, another very ardent fighter for social justice and for fairness, and who understands very well the what the economists would call the opportunity costs of this spending. All these extra dollars we will spend on the military take away from the needs of families and children. We made big promises about helping poor people on welfare get off welfare and get into jobs. And our ability to do that, at the very least, depends on more resources than we've made available. So any effort to put more and more of that domestic money into the military is going to take away very directly. And Lynn Woolsey has worked as hard on this as anybody in Congress.
Well, first of all, I want to thank my colleague Barney Frank for holding this intervention today, and thank you for being on the Judiciary Committee. And I certainly would thank the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee. I had a lot more confidence knowing you were both there, believe me. The President's budget was music to the ears of those of us that want to see more spending on education and Social Security and want both those issues to be a top priority. But it really struck a sour note with many of us by adding $12.6 billion in new defense spending. The question is, do we really need to spend $280 billion on defense, which is 4 times larger than that of Russia and the second largest spender? And I think you know the answer is no. Of course we should spend every penny we need to have a sound defense, but not 1 penny more. I support improving troop readiness, giving servicemen and servicewomen good pay and benefits and pensions, and I support the benefits that we have promised our veterans. But we can find money for this by cutting Pentagon bloat. We are planning to spend $35 billion on over 300 F-22 fighter jets, even though No other country can match our existing fighters. In fact, the money we spend on each F-22 could fund Pell Grants for over 100,000 students. One F-22, 100,000 students, Pell Grants. At a time when our declining force structure is stretched virtually to the breaking point, when our most skilled personnel are leaving the service in droves, it is disheartening to witness the scale of unnecessary and wasteful spending in the defense budget. We should be investing in only those programs that will prepare us to confront the international challenges we actually face, like the Nunn-Lugar program that keeps nuclear materials out of the hands of terrorists. That's what we should be spending our money on. Instead, we continue to spend money on outdated weapon systems that are designed to protect us from weapons that don't even exist. Take, for example, the $6.6 billion the Pentagon is planning to spend to build a national missile defense. The U.S. has already spent over $100 million on missile defense with little to show. We all remember Star Wars. Yet here we are, again, looking to throw good money after bad. Even the Pentagon admits that there is no significant long-range missile threat to the United States at this time. Let's face it, despite talk about declining military spending and suggestions that military has taken its fair share of spending cuts, military spending still consumes much too much of our federal government budget. We need to add back. We need to add back some sanity, and we need to put that sanity into our defense budget. And for heaven's sakes, let's invest in our children, our families, and our environment. These are the investments that we need. Our children is actually the greatest investment we could make because they make our country secure. Thank you.
Actually, we have one last member, and it is a sign of the exquisite planning of this event that we have our last member of Congress, and our panel is going to start at 11 o'clock, and that's just typical of the clockwork efficiency with which everything happens around here. We're actually just trying to set a good example for the United States Senate, hard as that might be. And our final speaker today is one of the members of the freshman class, and we are delighted to have her join and show that this kind of concern continues to be a very vibrant one. When people are newly elected, that's often the best sign of what are the concerns of the electorate, because it's those elections, in this case Jan Schakowsky, who won a contested primary in Chicago with three good Democratic candidates. Her election is a sign of the continued concern that people have in the electorate about these issues. So we're delighted to be joined by Jan Schakowsky.
Thank you. I want to thank Barney Frank for inviting me to co-host this panel discussion with him, and the Council for Livable World Education Fund for assembling a group of wonderful experts for us today. I am happy to be part of an effort to carefully scrutinize the proposed $110 billion increase in the defense budget. It's the responsibility of members of Congress to do just that. Do we need such a large increase? Will it help us achieve our military goals? Those are simple and basic questions. The problem is they can't be adequately answered. Since the end of the Cold War, there has not been a reconsideration of U.S. strategy. I understand fully the need to compensate our men and women in uniform and support an increase in their pay. But what about billions of dollars in new weapons systems? And do we still need to maintain a capacity to fight two major wars at the same time? And what is the role of our allies, and how much nuclear capacity is necessary? Before making this huge investment, we owe it to the taxpayers to answer these questions. The Chicago Tribune, in a January 25th editorial, agreed with Representative Franks and the rest of the members of Congress who are answering these questions, who are asking these questions. The Tribune said, quote, "Frank and others question why European allies don't shoulder a greater burden of costs for missions in their own backyard. They also ask, quite reasonably, why the U.S. needs all the costly big-ticket weapon systems left over from the Cold War. With the budget battle lines drawn, Congress should get down to work immediately to evaluate and reevaluate the mission being tasked to the military and let the dollars match them. Those are the words of the Chicago Tribune, and I think should be our guidelines in this debate. I'm sure that this expert panel can shed some light on these issues, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I'd now like to call the members of the panel to come up. We have one panelist going to join us. Let me introduce and run, and I've asked John Isaacs, who has very ably done so much of the work on this intellectually and organizationally in documenting the need to keep the military budget at a more reasonable level. To sit in the Judiciary Committee, Democrats will be organizing. That's probably a good sign, by the way, that the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee went off to the Senate several weeks ago. We have not seen them since, but the fact that they have now signaled us that we should start organizing, that may be the bird that you see on the ark, that land may be in sight. So we are going to go and pick our subcommittees. But I am delighted to have a very distinguished panel, and they will each speak for about 10 or 12 minutes or so, and then we will have some questions and comments. And I want to include in that, when we get to the end, conversations that we will be having about what our strategy will be. But let me just say now to the people who are here and to people who may be watching this, our success in preventing this increase and beginning to get a rational military budget will be very dependent on what the public has to say. This is one of those issues on which I wish it were different, but there is, at the kind of establishment level, something of a consensus which I think is inaccurate. It's become the kind of political, easy position in Washington now to spend a little bit. I'm afraid the administration is going to take credit from the fact that there are some of us who think they should not be spending so much and others who think they should be spending more. As an aside, anyone who ever justifies his or her position on the grounds that he or she is being criticized from both this position and that position is really engaging in the worst kind of intellectual nonsense. Presumably there is one person on the far right and one person on the far left in the whole world who are not subject to being criticized from both sides. Everybody else, in fact, will be criticized from both sides. If you doubt that, just remember that there are people who think that the House managers and Kenneth Starr are soft on the president. So the fact that people criticize you from both positions is zero indicator of your rectitude, but the administration will undoubtedly try to claim that. So this debate will only be changed if the public joins in, and we invite those who are listening, as well obviously those who are here, if you agree with our position and if you would rather see some of the government's resources spent on important domestic needs and important international health and environmental needs, please let your representative and senator know. If there is not an outpouring from the public, this will not change. And I would just say to you, any member of Congress who tells you how he or she supports increased environmental spending, debt relief for the distressed nations of Africa and Latin America, more police on the streets, better housing for the elderly, prescription drugs for Medicare, or any of a long list, if they tell you they are for those, but also that they are for increasing the military, you are not being told the truth, because those simply are not going to happen. This increase that the President proposed to the military will inevitably come at the expense of adequate funding anywhere else. And it's time for people to be intolerant of that kind of intellectual dishonesty. So those who are advocates for increases in any of these areas ought to understand that they have to be simultaneously advocates for not wasting on the military the resources we will need to make a reality out of any of those things. And I think our full panel is here. Let me just introduce the members, and then I'm going to leave, and John will ably take over. We have Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institute, who is an expert on what the military really does need and how the money ought to be spent. William Greider, whose most recent book, Fortress America, The American Military and the Consequences of Peace, is a very powerful and passionate argument along these lines. Bob Borisage from the Campaign for America's Future, who has been one of the leading organizers of the effort to right the grievous imbalances in the way in which we spend public money. And Grace Reed from the Children's Defense Fund, representing one of those organizations which has done the best to document the need and can, in fact, more graphically probably than almost anybody else as a representative of the Children's Defense Fund, show what the social costs are of wasting money over here, which will inevitably come at the expense of the most vulnerable and exploited group in America, poor children. So I thank all the panelists for coming. I will now absent myself and turn it over to John, and I'll be back after we've picked subcommittees.
Thank you, Congressman Frank, and it's an honor to appear here today on an extremely important issue that has not been getting enough detailed scrutiny, in my judgment, as well. I have a somewhat more nuanced disagreement with the administration's proposal than some of today's earlier speakers, but I fully agree that the $110 billion proposal for an increase is excessive and more than our military requirements call for. I think that something on the order of half of that at most would be adequate to redress some of the most serious problems we see in our military readiness and to start to purchase equipment to replace that which is wearing out, largely from the 1980s Reagan buildup. But a big debate that has to happen, I believe, and which is only beginning at this point, is whether we have to replace today's weaponry with even better and more capable systems more or less across the board, or whether we can be a little bit more discriminate in the way we choose to re-equip the force. We don't have to necessarily buy systems that cost twice as much as today's in order to maintain a military that's highly effective, reliable, and safe for our service people. So I would like to, in a few minutes' time, really make three main points. And one is that, as I say, U.S. military readiness today is strained to some extent and should be redressed and does require a little more money in certain areas, but not necessarily a great deal. I would judge the President's proposal in this area as already quite generous and do not think any more is needed than that. The readiness piece, by the way, of his $110 billion proposal is roughly 2/3 to 3/4 of that total amount. I would support most of that money, although not all of it. Secondly, as I say, even though we do need to re-equip the force, in my judgment, most of the additional 30 or 40 billion that the President proposed out of that 110 billion, and most of the additional money Republicans and the Joint Chiefs are talking about, would be for a weapons modernization agenda that was put forth in the 1997 Pentagon Strategic Review, known as the Quadrennial Defense Review, and that I think is excessive, that has a much more ambitious approach towards replacing today's weaponry with tomorrow's more advanced weaponry than we really need. We don't have to choose between standing still technologically and going for everything. There are a lot of intermediate positions where we can modernize relatively economically, also make sure the force stays reliable and safe. And I think the Congress is doing a great service to start to have this debate to the extent that Congressman Frank and his colleagues here today can do so. And finally, even though I do support some form of a two-war strategy, I think today's is excessively pessimistic. And the fundamental point I will make, there are a lot of ways one could take on this current two-war strategy. But the main point I will make today, and which is not frequently articulated, is that South Korea has a much better military than we commonly give it credit for. And this is our major ally, deployed in an extremely robust defensive posture north of its capital, Seoul. It's not to say that a war in Korea, if God forbid it should ever happen again, would be easily completed. It would be a very bloody conflict, and U.S. forces would be needed in large numbers, in my view. But the time urgency of responding
would not be nearly as great as the Pentagon assumes. The model of war the Pentagon has for a conflict in Korea in the future is really quite similar to their model of war for what happened in Desert Storm, where we know the Kuwaitis were in no position to begin to resist an Iraqi invasion. And somehow that same model of warfare is now being retained and applied not only to the Persian Gulf, where Iraq's forces are much weaker than they were 10 years ago, but also to Korea, where the long-term shift in military capability has been very strongly in favor of South Korea. And so what I'd like to do to just give you a little bit more information on each of these three main points, one about readiness, two about weapons modernization, and three about the current two-war strategy, is to provide a couple of view graphs that I think will give you a little bit more data, and then try to wrap things up fairly quickly so we have plenty of time for other panelists in the discussion. So I'm going to try to use the view graph here and apologize that one of my two transparencies is a little bit busy, but I'll try to hit on a couple of big points on this important issue of readiness. But let me start with the issue of weapons modernization. And you see here a graph of defense spending over time based largely on Congressional Budget Office studies. The dotted lines are projections for the future given the current Pentagon weapons modernization plan. And here we are today. So you can see the problem here, and you can see this debate we've had in the last few weeks with a $110 billion increase here and a $150 billion proposal there did not come entirely out of the blue. The Pentagon's 1997 strategic assessment retained a wish list of weapons that was inevitably going to drive longer-term real defense spending upward if we retain that system, or that particular approach. Now, lower estimate and higher estimate, you can see that for all of those of us who spent a lot of time trying to make defense budgeting a profession, we're not very good at being accurate. This is not meant to account for uncertainties in the world or uncertainties in military operations. This is just that we don't know how to predict the long-term costs of weapons that are currently on the drawing board very well, because the cost of technology and other things is so inherently unpredictable, and because the Pentagon is a huge organization with books that its own people, many of them very capable, don't really fully understand or have a grasp of. But nevertheless, the trends here should worry us. And the midpoint here, the midpoint estimate constitutes roughly a $20 to $30 billion annual increase in defense spending. You multiply that by 6, and you can see where the president came up with his $110 billion. You multiply 20 to 30 billion by 6, take the upper bound, and you can see where the Joint Chiefs came up with their 150 billion or more. And this is the kind of pressure we're going to see continuing in the defense budget unless we fundamentally reassess current plans that people have been criticizing earlier today, I think very appropriately, for systems such as 339 F-22 fighters and so forth. I would support some targeted modernization in these major weapons platforms, but the good news today is we are doing so much with electronics, computers, communications, and advanced munitions that we can actually modernize our capability relatively ambitiously with these kinds of electronic guts, or these things that the big platforms carry. We don't necessarily have to modernize all the platforms themselves. And the good news about electronics and munitions and computers and radios is that they're relatively cheap in the scheme of things. So even if we may need to spend a little bit more in the sense that a lot of equipment from the 1980s is starting to wear out, we don't necessarily have to buy the F-22s and advanced submarines and joint strike fighters in the kinds of numbers now being proposed. We can buy smaller numbers of the advanced systems, keep buying things like F-16s to make sure the force stays relatively young and reliable, and put better weapons on the F-16s. And that's still a fairly ambitious approach towards improving our military. It does not force us to choose between standing still technologically and buying this ambitious plan. The second issue I'd like to turn to briefly here in some more detail is the one where I apologize for the busyness of my chart, but it's about military readiness, this term that gets thrown about a great deal today in the political debate. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but what it really means for the Pentagon is the near-term ability of a given unit to do what it's supposed to do, to measure up to its own potential. So does it have equipment that's reliable? Does it have enough people in the units? Does it have spare parts? Have the units been training adequately? These are the kinds of things that readiness is meant to capture, as opposed to long-term modernization. So it's distinct from purchasing new weapons. It should be thought of as a more short-term effect. And here the basic message is that today's military remains extremely good. The readiness of today's military, if I were grading it, I would say it's an A- or a B+. Now, the bad news is that it was an A 5 years ago, and the trends are mostly downward. And we are seeing some problems in the force. But for the most part, it remains about as good on a unit-by-unit basis as Ronald Reagan's military of the 1980s. Not quite as good as the early 1990s military of Desert Storm and immediately thereafter. And I think that should cause us some concern, but it's still in very good shape today. What that means is we don't need to elevate the readiness issue to a major national crisis. We should view this as the kind of thing that Congress, when it's working well, as it often does, handles very well. Year-to-year adjustments in budget accounts, kind of a cost-benefit analysis of various kinds of accounts at the margin, does not need to be elevated to a major national crisis. And let me just give you some snapshots of the data, because we get snapshots of anecdotes from those who are trying to demagogue the issue, and I think they sometimes overstate greatly their position. But again, there are going to be a number of... And I won't expect that all of you can necessarily see this in the back, so let me just highlight a couple of issues. One is the quality of equipment. Second is how hard we're training today. And the third is the kind of people we have in the force and the ability of the military to retain good people. Under equipment, what I've shown on the top line is that if you look at Air Force aircraft, for example, in the late 1980s, typically 80% of all aircraft were ready to fly and perform their missions at any given moment. In the early 1990s, that number reached a peak of about 85%, averaged across fighters, bombers, transport planes, etc. Today it has dropped, and it's a little bit below the 1980s level, in fact. But it's still quite good, because the 1980s level was during the greatest peacetime military buildup in this nation's history, and overall trends in that time and levels of performance in that time period were quite good. So we have dipped a little bit below 1980s levels in this one particular area. But we're still quite good. In the area of training, let me give you some good news and some medium good news. The good news is units that are deployed in Korea, Europe, those that would be in any expeditionary force, are training as hard as they ever have. Some of the units in the States are training not quite as hard, however, and I would prefer that that be changed. Today's military is relatively small, and we would like to get the maximum benefit of any of these units. However, we don't have enough ability to transport all these units simultaneously anyhow. So if one of them needs a couple months to get ready for conflict, it's not necessarily a major problem. Some units are going to have to wait a month or two or three to deploy, even if we have 2 simultaneous regional conflicts, as unlikely as that may be, because we don't have enough planes and ships to transport them all anyway. So if a few of them are training a little bit less hard today than they used to, that's actually no big problem, as long as that drop-off does not go too far. The other line I'd like to call your attention to on this training, and I apologize that it's a little bit of a macabre indicator, but it's how many of the brave servicemen and servicewomen in the U.S. Armed Forces today are losing their lives in routine deployments and training. The good news here, extremely good news here, is that safety is at an all-time best level, all-time high in the U.S. military, and death rates are at an all-time low. What this says to me is that today's people are extremely professional, training very competently, and still using good equipment. If the equipment were not still in good shape, you would have accidents that would preclude an historically best safety record in the entire history of the U.S. military. So that's more good news about training, and those levels are much better than they were in the 1980s. Number of people losing their lives because of deployments, training, or other kinds of accidents. Let me just sum up with 1 or 2 points on the personnel and pay. I believe it's correct to increase military compensation but we should recognize that it actually has not declined in inflation-adjusted terms in the 1990s. Stayed more or less at the same level when you factor everything in, including retirement, accrual, housing allowance, and basic pay. Because of how much we're asking out of the military, and because the economy is growing, I believe some slight increase is appropriate. But we don't necessarily have to view this, again, as a major national crisis. And I don't think we have to get into a political bidding war about how much more we have to add. We can think in a little bit more dispassionate terms about just how much money is needed in this area. It's not as much as some people say. Finally, I'm just going to ask you to look at one more indicator here, which is the number of recruits with high school diplomas, still higher than the 1980s level. Even though we're having some problems in recruiting and it is harder work, and the Navy fell short last year of its goals, the overall level of recruits is extremely good today in the U.S. military. And I guess I will ask you to look at yet one more line. The average experience level in the Armed Force is also at an all-time high. We have a professional force that has a lot of people who are a little concerned about how hard they're being used overseas. That's true. But nevertheless, because we've had a good military throughout this decade, the overall level of experience in today's force is excellent. And you see that, again, in the good safety records and the great performance of the troops around the world. So we don't need to demagogue the issue of readiness. It's actually in good shape. It does require some improvements. That's why I would support roughly half the President's $110 billion, but I think that's adequate. I think I'll reserve any further discussion of Korea for the Q&A in the interest of moving along here, but I'd be happy to weigh in on why I think the current two-war strategy is also excessive, even if, in my opinion, some kind of two simultaneous war capability is prudent. Thanks a lot, Sean.
As you heard from Barney Frank, he had to go off, and I think he's impeaching independent counsels. My name is John Isaacs. I'm with Council for the Livable World Education Fund. We're hosting this event. Our next speaker is William Greider, the author of Fortress America. It's an excellent book. It's available in your local bookstores. And he, too, will be talking about military spending and, as the book says, and the consequence of peace. Bill Greider.
Thanks, Jim. The argument of my book is more or less confirmed by these events of the President suddenly, in this period of general peace, announcing that we have to spend ultimately another $100 billion on the military institution. Americans are not focused on that yet, but I trust they will be in the next year or so, because it's a result of a deep collision within the military-industrial complex. And my book is not about budget numbers, but it's about real people sort of face-to-face with that crisis. Oversimply stated, it is that we never demobilized after the end of the Cold War. And I don't mean becoming a pacifist nation, but really rationally reconfiguring our services and their requirements for a world that does not have the specter of World War III always present in our political debates. It's true the forces were downsized significantly, the three services, but there was no serious attempt to change their design or really even to rethink their purpose. And the two-war strategy was a convenient cover, frankly, to keep everything in place until someday people had the nerve to think more deeply about it. Industry, as you must have read, went through a furious period of consolidation, mergers, acquisitions. More than something like 1.5 million workers, from shop floor machinists to engineer, design teams, marketing, lost their jobs. And the country went on with three big, I would say, mastodon defense companies, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, with pretty much the same industrial base. It's true some factories were consolidated, but on the whole, we still haven't faced the serious problem of what do we do with this huge industrial base that started in World War II and that went through ups and downs during the Cold War years, but is still out there. And it intended to get well, it does intend to get well, on the basis of a series of Cold War weapons systems, the planning for which really started in the early to mid-1980s. And once that process is started, it's very hard to say no. And so with very few exceptions, none of those new advanced weapons systems that were in the pipeline before 1992, say, are going to be stopped. All this leads to a profound collision within the military institution. You can't have all of that on a defense budget that shrunk somewhat to $260 billion a year. So what the military has done in the meantime is hack away bits and pieces here and there, whether it's maintenance and operations or personnel accounts or various other things that get pushed off into the future, including the payments for all these new weapon systems. And the effect is, I describe as of somebody with a disease that is literally devouring its own body. And that's the fundamental reality that leads to our sudden discovery of a readiness crisis. The good news, I think, is that military people really do understand this, and I'm not talking about the Joint Chiefs per se, but through the ranks of the three services. And I know this because going around the country promoting my book, I heard again and again from those people, confirming my own account of what things are like at this point. I would go on these talk radio shows, and typically the host would be at least moderately conservative, if not more so, and viewing me as some sort of alien peacenik who's wandered into his programming. And I would go through in more detail than I am now my examples and so forth. He would open the phones, and the calls would almost totally be from military people, either in the ranks or recently retired. And the first thing they would say is, this guy has got it right. That's what's happening. And then they would tell stories of their own, much more vivid in some cases than anything I've found, and very believable. Because it's not just personal anguish for them, they have a sense of nobody is listening to this. Nobody wants to hear it. And you know what? They're right about that. The public fundamentally doesn't want to hear this subject. For good reasons, of course. The Cold War is over. Don't tell us about weapons systems and defense budgets. But we're now at the moment where they've got to get a big shaking from people who care about national priorities, obviously. One of the things I heard from some military people, including in this town, is a perception which I think is new and important. They're beginning to grasp that the industry, that is the arms makers, are rolling the services on this subject. That whatever the level of the readiness problem, it could be solved in very short order simply by abandoning some of these dreams for another generation of Cold War weapon systems. And so as they see the politics developing, they hear the senators and representatives talking about readiness, but they see the money going to the same old kind of stuff that gets turned out by the military-industrial complex. This president, I think, has played a very clever stratagem, as he often does, in which he makes a full-throated gesture toward dealing with the problem. But the damage on his budget is quite slight. But he says, we'll solve it in 5 or 6 years, $100 billion plus more over that period. He's not going to be president across those 5 or 6 years. So his stratagem begins a really profound, I think, fiscal problem for the next president. If it's Al Gore, he's going to have to decide, did I sign on for that? Or can I get out of it now that I have committed myself to it? And this will be the politics of the 2000 election. And I guarantee you, the usual folks will be trying, either publicly or privately, to get very clear commitments from all of the presidential candidates announced that this is the script, $100 billion plus over the next 5, 6 years, and Republican candidates will attack Democratic candidates for being somehow inattentive to the readiness of our forces, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very old argument, and it does make one sad for the country to think that in this time of general peace, we're going to have to fight it all out all over again. But that's where we are. The problem with Clinton's budget, frankly, is, as I told John, in for $1, you're in for $100 billion. And I think that's politically, that's the situation. If you start down this road accepting the analysis, how do you get off? Let me give you just a couple of glimpses of the problem on the ground, which brings some of this to life, maybe. And I go in loving detail in the book, because one of the things I do feel, and I think it gets neglected, is that the military has enormous capacity as an institution in this country as a social ladder. And when you go on the ground, whether it's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, you see living examples of that again and again. The military knows how to train people to do highly complex work, and there's not much room for error. If you get it wrong when you're fixing the engine for a jet bomber, somebody can die. And I think this probably would always happen to me in any period, but particularly now, there's a poignancy about their condition, because you see these kids doing extremely complex work and doing it very well. And you realize that in some ways that they are the confirmation of a lot that's been done over the last 20 or 30 years, but they're also in the dilemma at a quite personal level. I was at Nellis Air Force Base, and to see their red flag exercises where they do mock battles, which are an amazing thing to watch and describe. But I found myself pulled by the personal stories of the stress all those people do feel. And they tell many stories about how they're and it's partly they've lost that central organizing purpose in why they went into the military. The Cold War, whatever one thought of it, was a mobilizing issue for this entire country. Again, whatever side you were on in the particulars. And it's gone now. And it's gone for people in uniform. So they're bouncing back and forth to Turkey, to Iraq, to the Gulf, or the Balkans, whatever, in a kind of helter-skelter way that changes their lives. They'll do their duty, of course, but there's not much appreciation for that, I think, in just the human scale. There's a flyer they gave me at Nellis that said it was a warning about how to prevent suicide among your friends and colleagues, and it went through the usual ideas about how to deal with it, and said in passing that suicide is now the second highest cause of death in the Air Force. It's not out of control, but it's just a symptom of what I'm trying to describe, that suicide is now the second highest cause of death in the Air Force. It's not out of control, but it's just a symptom that people in uniform are feeling in different ways. I was at Fort Hood, and I would urge you, if you're ever in Killeen, Texas, drop in and ask them to show you give you the tour. The motor pool at Fort Hood, that's the home of Army armor units. And I think it's the biggest military installation in North America. You start at one end and you drive along these rows of M1 Abrams tanks, and then Bradley fighting vehicles, and Humvees with rocket launchers, and trucks and tankers, and then more tanks and more Bradleys, et cetera, for 5.5 miles. And of course, at the end of it, you're totally doped out by the experience. But I think I saw 2,500, 3,000 armored vehicles. That's a fifth of what the U.S. Army has. Most of them are not deployed on active duty because they don't need them deployed on active duty. My point is, there is enormous redundancy already in our arsenal. And you could justify that, or you could make a rationale for that if you really thought we were about to fight over Europe with the Soviet Union. it's much harder to sustain it when nobody has any serious explanation that world war is around the corner. It is very, very expensive just to maintain this. And at Fort Hood, they told me it costs $2,000 an hour to operate an M1 tank in the field. $2,000 an hour. Because the costs of training people in these vehicles is so high, Lockheed Martin and some other companies have invented a video game, which they call a simulator, and the tank crew literally climbs in this box and they watch a TV screen with a, I would say, not especially good cartoon picture of the battlefield, and the cannon breech and all the other gizmos are there. And I was looking at that. They have a huge training center full of these big boxes. And I said, well, and we went into the computer room where they were doing the operating programming for these mock battles. And the operator, one of the computer designers, said, well, we're using Soviet tank doctrine here because there really isn't any other tank doctrine in the world that's worth playing with. And I observed quietly that, well, the Soviet Union no longer exists. And the company rep said, yeah, that's true, but it would cost a whole lot of money to change this thing now. And he was sincere. I don't want to make fun of him. He was trapped. They started this thing in 1985 and it got it up and running. You want us to spend millions of dollars reprogramming it for an enemy we can't even identify? I mean, that's the dilemma for the armed services. And you can spin out scenarios endlessly, of course, about somebody who might be an enemy someday. But it's pretty hard to plan for sort of a fantastic future that nobody can see. Third glimpse is at the Lockheed Martin plant, and I saw some others where the same story is told. Fort Worth, Texas, where they make the F-16, which is a great fighter plane by all accounts. They're making 50 or 60 a year now, not for the U.S. Air Force, which bought about 3,000 of them over the last 20 years, but totally for export. And to make it overly simple, they're basically trying to keep that factory, which is a mile long and now has hundreds and hundreds of acres of empty space. They're trying to keep that factory alive. So until they can get some chunk of the F-22 or the Joint Strike Fighter after that, or maybe something else will come along. Now the kicker is you own that factory. It's a government-owned plant that was built in 1942 for World War II, and we have owned it ever since. There's another government-owned plant in Georgia where Lockheed Martin will make most of the F-22. You don't have to be a wizard to say, wouldn't it make sense to close one of these? And of course, it reveals the political subtext of all these decisions. If you made that decision, which would be rational business, you'd have to choose between Georgia and Texas, which are two of the central legs of the political base supporting all of this stuff. You might be able to get away with throwing California over the side because we all know California is quite divided in its views on this subject. But you can't dump Texas and you can't dump Georgia. Multiplied across the entire defense industrial base, this refusal to make the hard choices has produced gross overcapacity. Too many factories and not enough demand for what they make. Jack Gansler, who's now the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions and Procurement and has been studying this for 20 years, estimated that the defense industrial base probably operates around 35% of capacity. That's why they're exporting, to keep to not only keep, but to gain market share. And I would argue that the expansion of NATO was driven at its core by a contest for market share around the world. Others would say, oh, no, that wasn't the heart of the matter. Okay, it wasn't the heart of the matter. It was parallel to the geopolitics of why we should expand NATO. Everybody in the defense industry, the customer pays for all of this excess, and that's us, and that's a budget question. But I think it's also It's also dangerous for lots of reasons. I'll try to get to those. People have talked about different weapon systems. I'll just give you, and some of this you've heard perhaps. The F-22 costs $180 million a piece now. Price is rising for these reasons I've described. They're building they want to build new Navy attack submarines, a whole new class of subs for $2 billion each. The Army has the Comanche helicopter. They want to buy 1,300 of them at $80 million apiece. The old Black Hawk helicopter, which had fewer capabilities, but it was a perfectly good helicopter and still is in use, cost $7 million. So what you're seeing, partly because of the overcapacity, and that's another way of saying the lack of a more robust market demand for these weapons, the price creeps up. That's a natural economic function of trying to produce something for which there's not enough buyers. This would be the old Cold War argument all over again. We've argued over a lot of similar questions for 30 years. With this difference, I think, there are smart, interesting people in and out of the military who have been saying for the last 5 or 6 years, here's what you ought to do. Here are the reform ideas that would make some sense, that would rationalize our defense structure, and also reduce the cost for the taxpayers. Brookings is one of those. I talk to defense intellectuals in uniform and out. I think one of the important voices on this is Senator John McCain of Arizona, who has credentials that cannot be questioned, and he has a lot of ideas, including whacking some of these weapon systems. Another idea which he promotes is called tiered readiness. If you're not going to change the force structure in any serious way, then go to a system where maybe a third or half or some number is held at that readiness, ready to go, as Mr. Hanlon described it, ready to fight tomorrow, in effect. And the rest would be on a less prepared level. That makes a lot of sense. It would save a lot of money. You could also reduce the force structure. That's manpower and weapons and weapon systems ready to go. Gary Hart proposed a more dramatic version of that kind of change where he said, let's go back to a reserve force, and we'll keep a third, some portion of the existing force, a quarter, a third maybe, and they will be the trainers and the readiness forces for whatever we see on the horizon. That would save even more money, and in some ways it makes more sense. The budget outlines I have seen, and this is not an argument between hawks and doves, it's mostly about military people trying to think ahead as to not the last war, but what's the next war look like, and how do we prepare for that? And that gets into information warfare and lots of other stuff. Those budgets they put together typically have run 200 to 220, 25 billion a year. Now that's a saving off the top of $40 billion of what we're spending now, before we get on this escalator to go up still further. Let me just talk a minute about political strategy. And I wish I had answers to John Conyers' questions, but this issue is, the paradox is this issue is deeply embedded in American consciousness and also repressed in a sense, because people really don't want to hear about this. They know it's there perhaps, but it's very hard to get people outside the military to engage serious questions about it. I think the big strategy ought to be divide the military-industrial complex so that it is somewhat at war with itself. And the facts I have described support that. The military people would disagree with perhaps a lot of what I have to say about force structure and so forth. In fact, the three services always disagree among themselves. But they know something's got to give. And a number of them are beginning to understand that the industry is creaming their dilemma for its own purposes. And so I would put a hand out to military voices. And I'm not just talking about defense intellectuals, and certainly not the Joint Chiefs, which will always be stuck to the party line, whatever they say privately, but to the middle ranks of officers and enlisted people who can both tell this story from their own experience in a very convincing way, but who also, they don't want to go back to World War III or the Cold War necessarily. They want to have a purpose they can understand, and they want to be ready to serve that purpose and protect the country. But they want some rationality themselves in this, and they know they're suffering from the present evasions. I would attack head-on the regional politics that's embedded in defense spending. And this looks on the surface like restarting the Civil War, but the fact is a handful of states are really the major beneficiaries, particularly on the manufacturing side. And so you ask, why should Iowa or Illinois keep a factory open in Fort Worth, Texas, that is not producing any aircraft for the U.S. military? It's not an unreasonable question. And I think going after individual weapon systems puts the knife to that question of who's going to lose, Texas or Georgia. New York already lost its battle. Finally, what people have been talking about mostly here is the subject of national priorities and making as concrete as possible and visible that if you're going to go for this remobilization, it's got to come out of somewhere else. And that, I think, will be pretty clear to people 9 months, a year from now. There's a group called Business Leaders for Sensible Priorities, led by Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream, and he's gotten a number of business executives to sign up for a broad public education campaign, starting in rather soon, I think, that will begin to put these choices before people. Finally, this is not about money, but I think in some ways it's the most dangerous element of this subject. We are now in this drifting role of imperial beat cop, to put it crudely, in which different circumstances require us to go in and bomb somebody, or maybe at long distance, or maybe deploy a modest number of troops, and so forth and so on. I ask, first of all, where is the War Powers Act? New York Times today says we are conducting low-level warfare in Iraq. Was there a resolution from the Congress authorizing this? I think it's time now to bring that question back and try to make it visible to people. Partly because sooner or later, as we know from history, this blows up in your face. You get a sudden surprise or a bunch of people killed in what looked like a relatively safe situation. And then the politics of defense changes big time. American blood has been spilled. On the other hand, how did we get into this in the first place? And I think that's what scares me, frankly, about the buildup, is that, I forget who pronounced it, but there is an old rule of thumb in defense manufacturing. Use it or lose it. And when you go through creating a whole new generation of advanced weaponry and insist on deploying it without any visible threat that requires it, the pressure will be on the armed services and on political leaders to sooner or later use it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bill. Our next speaker is Bob Borsaj with the Campaign for America's Future and a longtime practitioner and expert on the question of budget priorities and the kind of budget choices that this country faces. Bob.
I'd like to step back a bit. Bill took you down into the bowels of the military-industrial complex. I'd like to step back a bit and look at this question of the budget choices from a broader perspective. Essentially, what we have is an agreement between the administration and the Republicans that the military budget should go up. And what this represents is, frankly, a statement that the Pentagon has survived the threat posed by peace. That is, both the President and the Congress now agree that a $270 billion annual budget is not sufficient for the United States at a time when we have no global rival. There is no military that holds a candle to the American military. These so-called rogue nations that are our designated enemies, Iraq, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, all spend less than about $3 billion on their military. All are in economic crisis and under great pressures to cut back on what they do spend. And all, except perhaps for Cuba, have no weapon that can reach these shores. So at a time when there is literally an absence of a threat, Colin Powell a decade ago said, we're running out of demons. We're down to Kim Il-sung and Fidel Castro. Now Kim Il-sung is gone. When there is literally no threat, when the Soviet Union is no more, the Russian army is scavenging for food, and its navy is literally rusting at its port, the United States Democratic President and Republican Congress have agreed that $270 billion is not enough each year. Now, this is an extraordinary statement, and what's remarkable about it is the Pentagon makes a pretty good case, as Mr. Hanlon and Bill suggest, that they need more money. That is, the troops ought to be paid more. We have families that are on food stamps, which no legislator should stand for. It's an outrage. There is a problem of somewhat declining readiness, although greatly over-exaggerated. There are veterans that are particularly skilled pilots, et cetera, that can find better employment elsewhere, and the military is worried about losing people in different places. And, of course, as the GAO and others will agree, if you accept the military plans, it doesn't have nearly enough money to buy the things that it's set out to purchase and that it claims it needs. So how can it be that there is literally no threat and $270 billion a year is not enough? There's something screwy, if you will, and I think the way to think about this is the four failures. There are four fundamental failures that have taken place at the end of the Cold War over the last decade that are now coming home to roost. The first failure others have referred to, I'm not going to go into it at length, was the failure to take on the two-war mission. That is the Pentagon's mission that it will be able to fight two major wars at opposite ends of the world at about the same time with no allies. It has used that essentially, as the former Air Force Chief of Staff's Joint Chief said, as a way to defend having a very large standing military. When you have a very large standing military and a set of force structures that allow you to move forces across the world to two different major regional conflicts at the same time, you create a lot of requirements, as the military calls them, for weapons. The administration has had two major reviews, the bottom-up review at the start of the Clinton administration and the quadrennial defense review, neither of which bothered to challenge this mission, even though it is a mission that is utterly implausible against a threat that literally doesn't exist. Secondly, there is the failure, given the mission, to challenge historic entrenched roles and missions of the services. That is, decades ago, the military divided up who would do what. But the result was a series of overlapping roles and missions. A few years ago, when the Clinton administration just started, Robert Reischauer, who was then the head of the Congressional Budget Office, wrote a report on this. And he said you could save up to $30 billion a year, simply by sorting out overlapping roles and missions. The United States is the only military in the world that has two expeditionary armies. We have 3 air forces. We have several different missile defense programs and other intelligence and other services that are remarkably overlapping and redundant. So simply by sorting those out, without changing even the mission, you could save dramatic amounts of money. But we failed to do that. And the President's commission that was designed to look at roles and missions decided up front that that would be much too controversial to get into taking on those questions between the services, and so it would not take on those questions. The third failure is the failure to challenge an acquisition process, a procurement process that basically is continuing to buy weapons that were invented at the time of the Cold War on the basis of exaggerated estimates of the capabilities of future the next generation of Soviet weapons, And now the Soviet Union is no more, and there is no next generation, and we're still buying those weapons. The irony of that process is we pay more and more for fewer and fewer of those weapons as they become ever more complex. Now, for example, the Pentagon is committed to spending $415 billion on new aircraft in 5 major aircraft programs. The F-22 you've heard about, the F-A-18EF, the Comanche, the V-22, the Joint Strike Fighter. 5 major new aircraft programs at a time when the aircraft we have no rivals in the world, and no one is building anything that will rival them. Again, that entire process failed in terms of any reform. The fourth failure, the failure to treat the Pentagon as what it is, which is the world's largest, most costly, and most wasteful bureaucracy. We tend to get mixed up because we think about the troops, which all Americans support, and we forget that this is a $270 billion bureaucratic behemoth. When you think of big government, this is it. The Pentagon spends over half the discretionary budget. It issues over half of the federal paychecks. It buys over about 2/3 of all federal purchases of goods and services. It sponsors over half of all federal research and development. It runs the largest educational enterprise, school district, if you will, in the world. It is the second largest health care provider and the first largest daycare provider in America. It is a massive, complex, extraordinary, unparalleled, and massively wasteful bureaucracy. And simply dealing with the waste, fraud, and abuse, which is endemic in the Pentagon, could save billions. Each year, the General Accounting Office releases a report about high-risk bureaucracies that are challenged by their management, and their programs are at risk of fraud and abuse. And on January of this year, last month, the GAO released its report on the Pentagon, and it reports the following. After decades of neglect, the Pentagon has a financial management system that is, quote, unable to properly account for billions of dollars in assets and unable to produce reliable information to make sound resource decisions. The Pentagon has a weapons procurement system that, quote, consistently pays more and takes longer to develop systems that do not perform as anticipated, unquote. It has a contracting process that continues, quote, erroneous, fraudulent, and improper payments to contractors, payments of higher prices for commercial spare parts than necessary in $100 billion a year that the Pentagon spends on contracting for goods and services. It has an inventory management system that is, quote, ineffective and inefficient, resulting in the DoD spending, quote, more than is necessary to procure inventory, yet items are not available when needed, unquote. It has an operations and support structure that has not been reduced proportionally to the force reductions, and its financial operations now involve 32,000 bookkeepers and accountants, the managers of which they did a poll of 1,400 managers that are at the higher levels, and they found that none of them in the last 2 years had received any education or instruction in basic accounting or financial management instructions. This accounting system cannot account for billions of dollars in basic transactions. The DoD, it was reported an estimated $22 billion in disbursements that it was unable to match with corresponding obligations, $9 billion in materials that it purchased but could not find or account for. And this says nothing, the GAO says nothing about the pork that is laded onto this bureaucracy by the Congress that Bill and others have referred to. John McCain, Republican senator, conservative Republican senator, identified last year $5 billion worth of what he called pure pork that his colleagues had added to the military budget. So when you take the 4 failures, then if you assume those, which is what the president and the Republicans do, if you assume that none of those failures can be addressed, then there is an argument that says this military needs a little bit more money. But of course, the only way you can address those 4 failures, the only way you can force them to be addressed, the only way the public can intervene in this argument and say, we want this bureaucracy under control, we want this mission rethought, we want the redundancy to be eliminated, is to keep the lid on the military budget and to keep the pressure on the bureaucracy internally to fight it out among themselves and to sort this out because of their own pressures. Without a lid, once you take the lid off, once you say there is, in fact, you have escaped the threat posed by peace and you now can have rising military budgets, there's absolutely no reason for either the administration or the Pentagon to begin to undertake these very difficult challenges of dealing with the 4 failures of the past. Now, there are many in this town who says it doesn't matter. The Pentagon budget is now at a record low percentage of GDP, lower than it's been since World War II. It's only about 16% of the total federal budget. The real money that's increasing is in entitlements, Social Security and Medicare. So we're not talking about a lot of money in a $1.7 trillion budget. If the president wants to pump this up to $300 billion, we shouldn't be so upset about it. But as Barney has said, Representative Frank has said, there is this problem, which is we are operating under a budget regime in which discretionary spending is capped, and it is under severe limits. And if you add more to the defense budget, you will have to take it out of domestic spending. But then the argument is, well, wait a minute. We have the surplus. We have $4.4 trillion worth of surpluses coming over the next surpluses as far as the eye can see. If we throw a few more billions of dollars, $100 billion or so at the military, hey, we can afford it. This is a very rich government, a very rich country. If you actually look at the surplus in the president's program, though, it's very interesting. 88% goes for Medicare and Social Security. I think the Congress will, in the end, Republican Congress will agree to that. 77% goes there. 11% goes for these private savings accounts, essentially a tax break for Americans, hopefully targeted towards lower income Americans if we do it. That leaves about 12% of these surpluses, about $480 billion over 15 years in discretionary funds. If you take the Pentagon's desire for $30 billion a year, or which the Republicans hope to get for them, or you take the president's end year of a $20 billion increase on the top line in his 5th year, you are going to consume most of that $484 billion. Most of the riches of the surplus is going to be consumed for a Pentagon in peacetime that faces no threat. And then you are not going to have money to address the problems here at home. Let me just say one word on that because I know my colleague's going to speak to that in more depth. This is a country that has 1 in 5 children in poverty. We do less than any other industrialized country to lift them out of poverty. We do less, despite all the rhetoric, of any other industrialized country of providing equal opportunity at the start. And we, of course, pay more in jail care and in crime and in aggravation and in unemployment because we don't make those investments at the start. Now, obviously, we have enough money. We make a choice of priorities not to spend that money on health care, on proper nutrition, on decent housing, on Head Start, and on decent schools. And that's the choice that's before us now as we face $4.4 trillion. I had a good friend in this Congress named Ron Dellums, who was the congressman for almost 30 years from Oakland. Ron told the story as he retired about he came here in the mid-'70s and he said to people, my people are poor, my children are going without health care, there are homeless people, we need to invest in poor people and poor children in this country. And he said, my colleagues in the Congress said to me, you know, Ron, we care about this. You're right. This is incredibly important. But the Cold War, we just don't have any money. We have to fight the Cold War. You have to defend America in the Cold War. He said, and then in the 1980s, a decade later, the Soviet Union disappeared. The Cold War was over. And I went to my colleagues and I said, we still have poor children and they have no health, and more of them have no health care. And the schools are in worse shape and we can invest in them now. And they said, absolutely. This is why we're in Congress, Ron, is to take care of these problems. This is the real deal. But we have these huge deficits. And we just don't have any money. We've got to pay down these deficits. So, I'm sorry. He says, and now it's the 1990s. Another decade has gone by. And the deficit is gone. And we have surpluses as far as the eye can see. And I've gone to my colleagues and I say, there are even more poor children. And even more without health care. And the schools are in worse shape. And now we can invest in those children. They said, Ron, that's the agenda. You got it. This is the most important agenda, except first, we got to pay down the debt and build up the military in spite of the fact that we can't identify the threat. Now, something is very wrong here. And all of this depends on the American people on this subject, on the subject of military spending, being acquiescent. That is, this is an elite debate driven by elite discussions, made inordinately complex in order to, in fact, cow people and keep them out of it. And for the most part, we count on the public being acquiescent, not being involved until the debate is done. And most people, sensibly enough, think, well, if a Democratic president and a Republican Congress can agree on this, they must be in the right ballpark, and we want the strongest military in the world, which we should have, and so what's the problem here? And the problem is that we are headed down a road, as Bill says, that once you open this lid, you're in for $1, you're in for $100 billion, you're in for a lot more than $100 billion. And you are making choices on the other side of things that we can't do or won't do that are very damaging to the society that we live in. Thanks.
Document as well as anybody can both the need for these funds addressed to children and how we could in fact do something. We're glad to have Grace Reed from the Children's Defense Fund, the premier organization advocating for the needs of children in poverty in this country.
I think, as I've heard here today, what we're really talking about are priorities. What are our priorities going to be? Going to the next millennium, looking at what the surplus is estimated to be. I think what we saw on Friday with CBO coming out saying, you know, over the next 10 years, we have $2.6 trillion in surplus. It's $768 billion on budget, which is the amount that excludes Social Security receipts, and $1.9 trillion off budget, which is Social Security receipts. So we're talking about what kind of priorities we're going to set with more than $1 trillion. You know, how much is $1 trillion? What exactly are we talking about? You could travel from the Earth to the sun and back 5,000 times. That's 1 trillion miles. If you lined up $1 trillion bills end to end around the equator, you could travel around the Earth 3,800 times. That's 1 trillion. 1 trillion is a lot. I have to think that within $1 trillion, there is room for military spending. There is room for tax cuts. There is room, possibly, for paying down some of the debt. There is room for all of the things people are talking about. But what we face today is a question of, who's going to set those priorities and how are we going to make the decision to get to those priorities? The president has said he wants 62% for Social Security, 15% for Medicare, 12% for new retirement accounts, and 11% for other. Spending on children is in other. Others suggest 62% for Social Security and 38% for tax cuts. I've heard some say that we have to do the 38% for tax cuts because if we don't, the Democrats will just spend it. Well, the Children's Defense Fund is a nonpartisan organization. But we are not ashamed to say that's right, and investing in children is a good way to spend some of that money. There's over 11 million children today who don't have health insurance. Spending on those children is not a shameful thing. About 4 million children under 12 go hungry, and about 9.6 million are at risk of hunger. Making sure that children have enough to eat is not a shameful thing. There are 8 million people, 2/3 of whom are children, on TANF. We need to work with the states to figure out how to get those families to become self-sufficient. how to make sure that they have a roof over their heads, and how to make sure that they can provide for their children. There are 10 million children who could use child care assistance. We're helping about 1 million now. The average cost varies throughout the country. There's probably some way, with some slight portion of this $1 trillion surplus, that we can help families afford the cost of child care and make sure that child care is available in every community and make sure that it's quality child care in every community. The dependent care tax credit, because we're not all about spending the Children's Defense Fund. We're looking for the best way to help children and families. The dependent care tax credit. You know, there's a cap on expenses, how much you can take for the credit. For one child per year, the cap is at $2,400. If you have under 10,000, if you're from a family with under 10,000 in income, you can take a tax credit of 30% of the $2,400. I'm not exactly sure how a family with under $10,000 could have expenses of $2,400 for child care and get that tax credit, but that would be allowed by law. For families with 2 children, the cap's at $4,800. These haven't been adjusted since the early 80s, you know, possibly 1982, something like that. I'm a mom. I have 3 children. My kids are 5, 3, and 7 months old. I spend $2,400 a month, and I don't have Cadillac care. I have local daycare. Unfortunately, you know, we live in a major metropolitan city, and it's expensive to have daycare full-time for 3 children. But I spend more in 2 months than I'm allowed for the entire capped expense amount for the year. Just to throw out that it's an area that we ought to consider when we haven't adjusted something in 20 years about whether it is really reality today. So we have a lot of choices. I hope as people decide to leave that they look at a one-pager that we have on the table using a portion of the federal budget surplus for children. We're not saying use all the surplus, we're just saying use a portion. For Head Start, to fully fund it, you could add another $7 billion. For after-school care, since some 5 million children throughout the country go home alone every day, those who are most likely to start smoking or drinking, or that's when juvenile crime peaks after school between 3 and 7 at night. We estimate that, you know, we could reach maybe half the kids with $7 billion. WIC. Let's talk about fully funding WIC. We add an additional 4.9 million women, infants, and children, be about $2.5 billion. Since everybody talked about the military budget, I'm really not going to today. But I will say that with regard to school construction, the General Accounting Office has estimated it would cost about $112 billion to renovate and upgrade our children's schools. We have a lot of children who go to school every day and they sit under crumbling roofs. They don't have running water. They've got lead or asbestos. There are a lot of problems in our schools. Some need to be rebuilt, some need, you know, merely to be renovated. But it's interesting that GAO estimated it would be $112 billion to fix the problem. The same amount as the requested defense buildup. For housing assistance, there are 5.3 million families who have very worst-case housing needs. They pay more than 50% of their income in rent. They live in substandard housing, very substandard housing, or they live in overcrowded conditions. They're doubling up. We could maybe help half of them for maybe $16 billion a year. Sounds like a lot, but again, don't forget we're talking about $1 trillion surpluses over the next 10 years. I was listening to Bill, I guess everybody's going to quote Bill today, say that operating an M1 tank is $2,000 an hour. This is back of the envelope, but I quickly jotted down that that's $48,000 a day, $336,000 a week, and $1.45 million a month. For that, we could be helping 5,800 children with after-school activities, or another $2,900 a month with WIC. There is a lot of things that we could be doing if we want to sit down and figure out how we're going to prioritize this surplus. We have a lot of choices, and it's late, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. But what I will say is, given the choices that we have, we're already off and running. Last week, the Senate Armed Services Committee voted 18-0 to one-up the president. I'm not criticizing a raise for the military, not at all. But while the president proposed a, 4.4% raise for the military, the Senate Armed Services gave him a 4.8% raise. Well, the president recommended that they would get raises each year after the year 2000 in line with the private sector. Senate Armed Services says, and we'll one-up you. So they're going to give a raise of 0.5% more than what the private sector gets. I think we ought to think about readiness, and there's a lot of talk today in this panel about readiness and what that means. But maybe once it could be about whether children are ready to enter school, whether they're ready to learn when they're in school, whether they're ready to become productive adults. And we can't get there overnight. We need to start investing. Just once, it would be nice if we had a bidding war on behalf of children.
We've heard 4 fine presentations discussing military spending and the budget choices this country faces. We have time for a few questions from the audience. If you might address them to one or more of the speakers. Does anybody have some questions? Think hard. Any questions, or all your questions have been answered? There's a question.
Yeah, this is to Bill Greider and to Bob Borsaj. Bob, you talked about acquiescence, and I think I've been in the city 15 years working on military spending issues, and nothing that I've heard is new. I mean, there's been a Pentagon underground that I think that you spoke to that have been critics of how the spending has been going on how the books can't be audited, on how the proliferation of the threat is being used to continue to raise these monies, and we've not been able to kind of rationally address the problem, either through acquiescence or, in a certain sense, complicity. And there's a phenomena that I've heard referred to as front-loading and political engineering, and I wish that there were members of Congress that were here during this to help answer the question, because I think it cuts to Congressman Conyers' question as well, which is how does this continue to happen? And the Congress, I think, really has to look at that issue, at the front-loading, at the fact that even members of the Progressive Caucus are voting bad on the B-2 because of the jobs that are in their district, and that it's very strategic in the way that these weapon systems are scattered across all the congressional districts. So I think it's a challenge to us to ask, how do we raise this issue so that people can look at it and focus on how we can get people to vote in a way that they think that they should vote, because they often don't, and how we get the Pentagon Underground's voice as a part of the debate. They used to be, and it was an effective consideration, when they would come to the table and talk about what was going on with the spending. It hasn't been a part of this debate. So I ask both of you to respond to that.
Well, as you know, there are no easy answers to this. I do think that there has to be a significant effort to engage different parts of the public in this debate. Across the country, there is an enormous passive constituency, if you will, of teachers, of daycare providers, of social security agencies, of people who are day-to-day engaged in trying to deal with the problems, the domestic problems of readiness in this society. And they have, on the whole, been absent from this debate, while they and their representatives often lobby one against another on the domestic side of the budget. They tend to stay out of the argument about the priorities between the domestic side and the defense side. And I think with this increase, once again, it is posed to them, the challenge has to be posed to them about getting back into this debate. Similarly, on the conservative side of the agenda, it is extraordinary to me that the most egregious example of big government, the most grotesque example of bureaucratic waste, fraud, and abuse is the place where conservatives want to pump more money in the pork that they love to support, et cetera. And I do think that conservative constituents have to hold their own legislators accountable and call them back to account for this. The economics of it have, or the politics, the political economics of it have changed somewhat. As Bill mentioned earlier, the old process where you would build a plane and you would make sure that you had plants in 50 states and in 340 congressional districts so that you could, with subcontractors, et cetera, you could have somebody lobbying on a majority of people as much as possible to defend your weapon system. Increasingly, this spending is concentrated, and there are more and more districts in the society that are disadvantaged by large military spending and cuts on the domestic side that don't profit from this. And so there should be more and more legislators that are free to ask questions and challenge these figures, as Senator Grassley, the Republican from Iowa, has been free to do.
All I'd add to that is that the jobs aren't coming back. And I think some members of Congress are beginning to grasp that. And at least for the last few years, that has set off a kind of defensive temperament psychology, which is, if they're not coming back, I'm going to fight like hell to hold on to what's still there. And I'm talking about bases, installations, as well as plants. But I think a politics that says, look, the logic of this thing, we'll spend $100 billion if the industry gets its way, and then that won't solve this problem I was describing, the collision within. So you're still going to take hits. But in any case, defense is not going to become an industrial employer again as it was through the Cold War in terms of employees. And the hopeful view is if the political linkages can be educated to that reality, then you'll get this, what I call the regional politics of, well, who's getting this money? And why are we subsidizing job creation in Texas and Georgia and some parts of California and the West Coast, Arizona, when you won't let us do that in our cities, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, one would have hoped that kind of sensibility had developed already, and it hasn't, partly because everybody sort of turned away from the questions.
Additional questions? Go ahead.
If anybody has numbers on our foreign military bases, how much they've declined over the years, and how much more could be closed down? What's the potential for downsizing in terms of foreign military bases?
There's been a greater decline in foreign military bases than in U.S. bases, mostly in Europe, although to some extent in other parts of the world as well. Just to start with numbers of troops, which is a number I recall better than the one you asked for. We typically had more than 500,000 troops either based overseas or deploying overseas during the Cold War. That number is now down by more than half, to about 250,000. In bases, I believe the proportion, the cut may be in the order of 40 to 50% relative to the Cold War, whereas on the domestic side, it's been more like 20%.
But you're saying, just to follow that up, we still have about 250,000 U.S. troops stationed permanently overseas?
Ballpark figure, it's about 100,000 in Europe, 100,000 in Asia, and 50,000 on deployments, largely in the Persian Gulf and other places where the Navy and the Marine Corps keep people overseas. So it's that rough ballpark now.
Any other questions?
That does raise this a broader point that's important for people to understand, which is there is sort of this, there's one bipartisan mantra that every politician will repeat that reflects the overwhelming opinion of Americans, which is that America cannot police the world. We will not be the world's policeman. And there's one kind of daily reality of this military, which is we are basically going about the world policing it. Not completely, but police don't cover every block all the time either. But our Navy is designed to sustain a global patrol in oceans across the world and to challenge the boundaries, the sea boundaries of different countries and the access through different channels, and to patrol them, and does so in literally constantly around the world. Our Air Force was in over 100 countries last year, moving troops and supplies from one place to another, engaging in rescues, doing the kinds of things that police do on the neighborhood block. Mostly because other countries, we are the only country that has the capacity really to move large numbers of forces across expanses of territory. And so other countries rely on us to move their forces when they move dramatic places. Our Air Force brags that it was in, I think, 87 countries last year, showing the flag, demonstrating, doing joint exercises, maintaining a patrol over our southern border in terms of drugs, maintaining the patrol over Iraq, etc. We have forces that we are going to keep 100,000 forces in Europe constantly, 100,000 in Korea, even after North Korea disappears, according to the Secretary of State, and the Koreans unite. We'll keep the 100,000 troops there if they allow us in Korea and Japan, and 20,000 in and out of the Persian Gulf as we maintain a low-level war with Iraq. This is an extraordinary commitment of the indispensable nation, as Madeleine Albright calls us, to patrolling the world. And there's an old kind of set of wisdom that's been abandoned about this, which is there was a great conservative senator named Richard Russell from Georgia, actually, who in the midst of the Cold War said, the problem with these budgets is the more ability we have to go someplace and do something, the more likely it is that we will go there and do it. And in this context, when there is no rival, and there is no threat, and there is no check, and we have amazing capacity to go places and do things, we in fact go there and do it. And for the most part, the American people have no idea of the extent to which we are unilaterally policing this world, rather than building up international institutions and regional institutions that could play that role. And as Bill said, the problem is, at some point this will blow up in our face, and everyone will be surprised at where we are and what we are about.
If I could just very quickly follow up, that's a very articulate statement. But I would just like to emphasize also, for the purposes of this discussion today, you don't necessarily need to object to much of our remaining forward presence to object to the $110 billion increase. Even someone like me, who is more kind of in the box in terms of accepting more of the assumptions of current U.S. security strategy, can still say that this $110 billion is a lot more than is necessary. So I think it's worth emphasizing that if even though many of us have different views on this panel, you don't have to accept one set of assumptions to wind up having some very serious concerns about this amount of a Pentagon budget increase at this time.
I think it raises an issue, one of the reasons I raised it, and the issue of foreign military bases. There's been kind of an implicit agreement, really, since the Bretton Woods institutions were created, that the United States would police the world, and Europe and Japan have deferred to and really allowed the Treasury Department to control the IMF and the World Bank, and the U.S. to really control the UN Security Council. And, as Japan and Germany still don't even have a seat there. And this has been going on in other international institutions as well. And the question is, every year I kind of hope that this is starting to break down. And this year there was some real disagreement in last October, actually, at the meetings of the IMF and the bank. The Europeans and the Japanese were saying, well, maybe we should have a voice because they could, in fact, outvote the U.S. in the IMF, but they've never done it. As you probably know, out of 2,000 decisions there in the last, I don't know how many years, there's been 12 votes. So there is really an implicit deal. And what I would like to know is, what are the possibilities? What do you think the possibilities are for convincing people now, especially after the IMF has racked up these disasters on 3 continents in the last 2 years, that this is, and it actually has a boomerang effect here with our trade deficit and everything. What are the possibilities of convincing people that this is actually a bad deal? We get to police the world, and then we get to control our government controls these institutions, which is actually hurting us as well.
Well, let me just deal with that more broadly. I argue in this book and in my previous book on the global economy that the fundamental issue of security and peace now is about that global economic system. And there's not a thing you can do with an F-22 or a B-1 bomber to change that. In fact, on the contrary, both the crises and collapses that have gone on in the last 2 years, and more importantly, the sort of new sensibilities and resentments that are being planted around the world toward U.S. leadership that has existed more or less for 40 or 50 years, have deeper national security implications than whether we build any of these weapons or whether we have 1 million people in uniform or 1.5 million and so forth and so on. And as you seem to know, our government is still standing by the flag it has held for 40 years, insisting that nothing much has changed, and if everybody will just behave the way we do in terms of banking systems and financial regulation, et cetera, they'll come out in the sunshine. Large chunks of the world now no longer believe that. Germany and Japan, Germany more directly and I think coherently than Japan, are both articulating different understandings now. If you read American newspapers, you not only never see this mentioned, but there's no indication that our leaders, including the Treasury Secretary, are willing to acknowledge that this is even happening, much less enter into a dialogue. I think that's dangerous, and especially dangerous if this economic crisis continues to unravel economies, which I think is happening still. That's an issue of peace, ultimately. That our leadership, our hegemony over the free world, now encompassing the formerly communist world, is both unprepared to think about seriously and also to even to acknowledge. So we're instead going to spend the next few years arguing over the F-22 and a bunch of weapons questions. Let me finish just by saying, if you compare this period, the last 8-10 years, with the period that followed World War II, the last time there was a great settlement or resolution of conflict, it gives you a sense of how inert we are. After World War II, there was Bretton Woods, there was the Marshall Plan. I'm just using the international. There was the creation of NATO and alliances across a broad front. And there was an understanding that the U.S., because it was the last standing industrial power, had to take the lead, whatever reluctance it may have had. And it did so, mostly successfully for 20, 25 years. I think that's over, and I actually think that's a good thing not only for the world but for us. But it's going to be harder to make that transition to what Bob called a genuinely international politics, which really does take rich and poor and put them at the table and give everybody a voice in these decisions. It's going to be very painful and difficult and fractious if we don't accept that that's the progressive idea now, not clinging to our control of things.
Taking the prerogative of the chair, I'll just ask the last question. If people are interested in these issues and they're interested in how much we should be spending on the military or how much we should be spending rebuilding the crumbling schools, how many kids should be covered by Head Start, what's the next step in the process? How will Congress be grappling with these decisions, and how can people talk to the Congress about these issues?
John, I think that's a question that you should answer.
No, I'm giving it to you.
Give everyone your website number. Seriously.
Well, no.
Our website is childrensdefense.org.
No, the question is, how does Congress deal with these choices ahead of how much we should be spending, the $1.7 trillion on the military versus these other questions? Where's the next step in the congressional process?
Well, as soon as the impeachment stops, the budget process presumably will start. The Congress will go through a process where it first decides, if all things go well, a unified budget set of ceilings that it assigns out to the appropriations subcommittees and the authorization committees. And then it will argue through a budget which should be passed, if all things go well, by the fall. Now, in the last few years, the way this has worked is that the Republican majority has had a very hard time agreeing among themselves, and much less agreeing with the Democratic minority or the president. And so we have come to the fall without a budget, and in most cases without most of the appropriations bills passed. And there's been what's called a large reconciliation, which is basically a very big negotiation in which almost all the numbers are on the table with the president and the leadership of the Congress, which usually takes place right as the session is ending in October or so, in which they divvy it up and they cut the deal between tax cuts, how much we're going to pay down on the debt, in this case for Social Security and Medicare, how much we're spending on defense and other programs. And the Congress will then pass a series of either continuing resolutions or a series of appropriations off of that reconciliation. So this process goes on in the Congress through this entire year. And the public engagement in it, while there are crisis points that I was serious about John giving his website that the Council for a Livable World and other groups will provide you with information on. The public can get in this debate almost at any time through the end of the year because it won't get wrapped up until October if we're lucky.
John tells me this is the end of questions. I had to go and vote, and I did want to get back before it was over, so I will now take this opportunity to explain to the public that I am about to miss a vote on approving yesterday's journal. Since we did not do anything yesterday, approving what we didn't do does not seem to me to require my presence. I want to thank the panelists and my colleagues who had attended, and I want to reiterate to the people who were in the room, who obviously know it, but to those who were watching us, Bob Borsage is right. The elites have decided this. I've been particularly disappointed by the lack of media attention. The president's budget came out, and a number of media outlets noted that there wasn't a lot of opposition to the military spending. It wasn't instantaneous. Some of us just needed some time to organize it. When we began with a dozen members last week to speak out, they tended to ignore it, and this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I do believe that if these choices are presented to the public as to how to spend the money, and by the way, one element I don't know, I know Bill was talking about today's New York Times, I just noticed because we're told we're in terrible, desperate shape, and we have all these very powerful enemies, and we don't have the ability to deal with them. Whether you're for or against what's going on in Iraq right now, the New York Times noted that just in the past few weeks, with a relatively low level of engagement in terms of the percentage of American forces involved, we have destroyed 20% of Iraq's air defenses. I mean, that just shows what an enormous disproportion, an almost incidental exercise of American power, given the totality of what America has destroyed 20% of Iraq's air defenses, and Iraq has been, after North Korea, the single greatest threat. So the notion that we are somehow in dire peril, and then unless we spend hundreds